Good evening. Our sincere apologies for the late start. As you all know, stuff happens. So, happy International Women's Day. My name is Chiedo Nwankwo, Vice Dean for Education and Academic Affairs. As we celebrate International Women's Day today, I'd like us to take a moment to acknowledge that we are walking a jagged line that fuses history, or more appropriately, her story, in this case, with the present. A mere century and a half ago, around the world, of course with variations across regions and countries, women lived under terrible and dehumanizing constraints created by practices and laws shaped by patriarchy and androcentrism. Women were not allowed to have a voice in public spaces, not allowed to own property, could not vote nor participate in formal government institutions, had little to formal education, could not earn wages for work done or earned just a fraction of what they were worth, had no bodily integrity and no legal recourse to gender-based violence, were forced to dress and speak in a certain way or not speak at all. The list goes on. It is the year 2023, and thankfully we have made remarkable progress from where we were a century and a half ago. Witness women's increasing participation and representation in governments, significant educational accomplishments, and a great stride in all walks of life, from business and science to sports and entertainment. Today we salute millions of brave and strong women, past and present, who have fought for dignity and equality for themselves and others. Women who have spoken truth to power, stared down the barrels of guns, and in most cases given their lives for that. Women who have lived through unspeakable hate and brutality in the pursuit of justice, equality, and a fair world for all. Ordinary women all over the world who toil day and night within the most austere of conditions, bearing hunger, abuse, and pain to take care of their families and children. We salute these women and all women all over the world, all sheroes, even though their capes are and will remain invincible and unseen, and their exploits remain thankless, yet we see them and we salute them. That said, we still have a long way to go on the long journey to the promised land of gender equality and parity. Last summer, the World Economic Forum released its latest Global Gender Gap report. The report found that at the current pace, it will take another 132 years to close the global gender gap. That report also stated that as crises are compounding, women's workforce outcomes are suffering, and the risk of backsliding in global gender parity is intensifying. Across the majority world, or what one might easily recognize as the global south, the pandemic has resulted in interlocking challenges. Simply put, women and girls continue to face many obstacles around the world as they strive to fulfill their dreams. But we don't have to accept the status quo. In fact, we cannot afford to. Through our words and actions, all of us can say to the women and girls in our lives, we stand with you. When you feel as if you don't fit, when your mind conjures the basest of emotions to convince you that your place is not on the table, look around, and you will find an army of people inviting you in and making a seat for you at the table. A sea of voices echoing your humanity and worthiness. Rise to the occasion, take the opportunity, and then hold up the ladder for the women coming behind you. Discussing with our guest today is our own Dean Steinberg, a true ally in this struggle for gender equality, diversity, and inclusion, whose strong belief in the humanity and equality of all people, male, female, shines through shines forth in his leadership, the inclusivity he shepherds, and his openness to reason, debate, and a willingness to see the best in others first and foremost. We salute you. Our guest today is one of such women that have held and continue to hold the ladder for women and men, especially across Africa. A woman of great accomplishments who exemplifies the spirit in the purpose of International Women's Day. Florrie Eliza is the president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, the leading US business association, focused solely on promoting business and investment between the United States and the nations of Africa. Florrie is a proud SAIS alumna, and all of us at SAIS are equally proud of her. Florrie is the third president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. She brings expertise and an extensive network on trade and Africa to her current role, along with a strong track record of working with the private sector to translate policy into action. She is the first woman to lead the council since its founding in 1993. Florrie joined CCA from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she was the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa since 2003. At USTR, she led trade and investment policy towards 49 sub-Saharan African nations and oversaw the implementation of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the AGOA. Previously, Eliza served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Industry, Market Access, and Telecommunications. From 2000 to 2003, she also served as Senior Trade Policy Advisor in the Office of International Transportation and Trade at the Department of Transportation from 1987 to 2000, worked as a director in USTR's Office of GATT Affairs, and served as an associate fellow at the Overseas Development Council from 1975 to 80. Currently, Florrie serves as a reappointed member of the 2022 to 23 Sub-Saharan Africa Advisory Committee for the Export-Import Bank, the EXIM, where she previously served from 2019 to 2021. Florrie also served as co-chair of the Advisory Council for the Millennium Challenge Corporation and has also served as a board member for the Women in International Trade. As I noted earlier, Florrie is a SAIS alumna. She holds an MA in International Economics from SAIS and a BA in International Relations and Political Science from Dixon College. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Florrie Eliza and Dean Steinberg as they begin their conversation.
Well, thank you, Dean Runcliffe, for those powerful words and for your kind words. It is a priority for us to try to achieve the vision that you've described, and we have ways to go, but we continue to work on it every day. And I can't think of a better way to mark the National Women's Day here at SAIS than to have such an extraordinary alum to be with us, whose career, as you just heard, is quite remarkable. And it really is an amazing career of public service and accomplishment. That's really an inspiration to so many. And you know, if we could start off our conversation, because it's always of great interest here at SAIS, you know, just tell us a little bit about your journey. So how, when you were here a while ago in SAIS, and how your career developed, how you got interested in the areas of trade and economics, and how that's developed, and how you've been able to pursue so many great and increasingly important roles over the last many years.
Well, thank you, Dean, and thank you, Associate Dean Nwankwo. Appreciate your words, powerful words. So I think that probably the best place to start is to say that I was not born in this country. I'm an immigrant to the country from Panama. And I came here when I was a little girl. Our parents moved to Brooklyn, New York. We had the typical immigrant family situation. You know, you're living with aunties and uncles, and then, you know, I recall when we finally got a place of our own, we had, you know, cousins and more aunties and so forth who lived with us. I think I was probably 16 before it was just my immediate family in the house. And the thing that was always very powerful, we also did not live in a very good place in Brooklyn, New York, in Bed-Stuy, but my parents were strong advocates of education, and they felt like they had come to the United States for that American dream. And we didn't have much money, but what we had was a faith in education and in the power of being able to use education to advance. None of the siblings, there are three of us, went to the local schools. My parents figured out busing long before busing was a thing. And I remember starting in 3rd grade, getting on public city buses. They didn't have those yellow ones that we have in this area now, and my kids and grandkids ride on. But public transportation to go to schools further away from where we lived, because my parents knew it was best for us. And you know, they said I was an intellectually gifted child. I was like, you know, who knows, right? What does that mean? But what it allowed me to do starting in 3rd grade was to go to a public school that was probably half an hour away from our home by bus. And I went by myself. So I started to learn certain things about being independent. I'll just fast forward, you know, all the way through school. I always remember that if I brought home 6 A's and a B, my father, he would look, and he still had an accent. My parents had accents until they died. What is this? This is a B? He said, Florizel. That's my full first name. Everybody calls me Florizel. I always knew I was in trouble. For my parents, getting a B was unacceptable. Unacceptable. You had to bring home all A's. And they kept that up. And they would instill in me and my siblings that we could do anything we wanted to do, be anything we wanted to be. So I went off to college, Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, majoring in political science, and I was going to be an attorney. I was going to be a lawyer. My parents were like, ooh, they were, you know, in those days, if you weren't a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. And I want to say in my 2nd or 3rd year, I came across a class called International Relations. And I took that class and I thought, wow, this is so interesting. This is really exciting. I had a professor who had come to SAIS actually years before. And he wanted me to go overseas for a year for the summer. He thought it would be great. My parents said, absolutely not. You cannot go overseas for a whole year. They thought I was too young. They didn't think it was safe. But they said, but you can go for a summer. And the summer after my junior year, I was privileged to go to live with a French family in southern France. I had been taking French in school. Don't speak it very well today, but at one point I was pretty good, pretty fluent. And in southern France, Aix-en-Provence, and then traveled with some young ladies. I don't know if they still have the Eurail pass now, but at the end of that 6 weeks, we traveled all over Europe on the rail system in Europe at the time. And when I got back, I went to that professor and I said, how do I get into this field? What's the way I get into this? And so he said, well, be a double major, political science and international relations. You've taken lots of classes by now, and you can do it. You can make it happen. So I went home to my parents in Brooklyn, and I told them that I wasn't going to go to law school, but I was going to go to a graduate school and get a degree in international relations. And you can imagine how that went over. My parents were like, well, what would you be? What do you mean? What will you be? You're not going to be a lawyer. You're not going to be a doctor. You're not going to be an engineer. Tell us what you'll be. And I remember that even then I thought, I'm just going to tell the truth. I have no idea what I'm going to be, but I know this is something that this field calls me. It talks to me. It speaks to me. So, Dean, that was how I came to SAIS, that essentially, in my last year at Dickinson College, I applied here. My professor told me it was the best place for me to go in this, that's right, in this field. He said, but you may also want to apply to Georgetown just in case you don't get into SAIS, right? He was very confident SAIS was the best place to go. And so I was really delighted when I was accepted to come here. It was probably before some of these young people were even born, 1973 to 75. And I don't know if they still do it this way now, Dean, but, you know, I took French. Africa was my region of focus. And I think I also had foreign policy as one of my core areas. And great professors here, you know, really excellent classes. And I think the only regret I had when I was here was that I did not take a break between undergrad and coming to SAIS. And I always felt like in the classes that I was a taker. I was getting a lot. But I didn't have a whole lot to like really give. There were people in the classes who had worked for, you know, 5 or 6 years, or they had been in the Peace Corps, or they had worked at the World Bank. And, you know, here I was, like 22, hadn't worked anywhere really. And so I always thought if I could have done it again, I would have still come to SAIS, but I would have done something in between for 2 or 3 years. And then I would have come here. So that's, you know, that's my story. If I could tell just one other story, when I got to my final year, and I had a professor of macroeconomics. I loved Dr. Isaiah Frank, and you know, he's long gone now, but I was, you know how they put your name in that book and you go and you interview at different places? They still do that, right? You get to go, and not so much, huh? So they had this book, and you could put your name, your resume in it, and then, you know, you might get to go and interview in different places. And I remember I was interviewed for a job at the IMF, and, you know, it was one of those jobs where it was, let me say it honestly, it was not a good job, but it paid very well. And I remember I was like, I don't think this is going to be a very, like, exciting job. And by then I was married, had a child. And so I thought, well, no, I didn't have a child yet. No. So I was married, but I didn't have a child yet. And I thought, well, this would be maybe a great start. Maybe I could start there and move to something else. And I remember I came to Dr. Frank and sat down with him for 20 minutes. And I said, Dr. Frank, I have this job offer from the IMF, but I don't really think it's me, but it pays very well. What would you do? And Dr. Frank just very, you know, he looked at me, he said, that job is not for you, Florrie. He said, I have a good sense of you, that job is not for you. And he's the one that put me in touch with someone at the Overseas Development Council, which used to be right across the street, ODC, and it was like a perfect fit. And I didn't make the money I would have made at the IMF. They were a small nonprofit that was educating the American people about the value of development assistance, investing into other countries and people. And I worked there for 5 years, and I loved it. So again, you know, starting out on that path and being true, that's really my story, being true to who you are and to your calling. It wasn't easy for me to tell my parents I wasn't going to go to law school, you know, standing up to them. Pretty tough Panamanian folks who were like, we brought you to this country to do certain things, and by golly, you know, and my dad, for many years, he would continue, even when I got my degree from here, he would continue to send me articles from Ebony and Essence magazine that would have clips of women who were judges, African American women who were judges, who were lawyers, okay? You know, he was like, came to my graduation, was very proud of me, but he continued to do that press for years after I had even graduated from SAIS. He didn't give up on the law thing for a long time. But in any case, my journey along the way, my being here at SAIS were and have been instrumental in my path, setting me on the path of international affairs and international economics, trade and development. That's what I love. I love trade and development. And I've really been blessed to be able to work in the trade and development field for many years. And I was in government for 36 years. And my last probably 15 or so years, I could really focus on Africa, which was like the icing on the cake. So that's more or less. I've gone on and on.
No, it's great. It's just what people want to hear, and it's a wonderful story. And it's obviously for all of us great to hear about how two of your professors, helped you along that path. I think we all like to think of ourselves as being here for our students, and it's great to hear that our predecessors here at SAIS played the same role for you. So I want to talk about Africa and U.S. engagement in Africa, and you've been able to observe this over a very long period of time, and as somebody who's looked at this and you had a little bit of a role early on during the Clinton administration. The U.S. approach to Africa has changed a lot over the time. A lot of our engagement in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s had a very strong Cold War focus and a kind of geopolitical focus. So give us a little of your sense about how this involved and how the engagement with Africa, particularly on the economic issues, has changed over time, and how you see what's worked and what hasn't worked in terms of the focus or lack of focus in the United States on economic growth and opportunity in Africa.
Right. So, there has been, an evolution. I think that the interest in Africa from the U.S. perspective is only now, or more recently, getting to be where it's about valuing the continent and its people and the countries in a particular kind of way. Early on, I think there was very much sort of the geostrategic, geopolitical interest in Africa, but not for the value of what the countries bring in terms of the global economy, in terms of their population. It was more focused on that. Then, there was a period, I think, where people were very focused on, there's nothing but conflict there. And there's nothing but, people dying of X, Y, or Z. Pick which one you want to pick. And then the focus became development assistance. We're gonna help that continent. We're gonna, and there's nothing wrong. I'm being a little bit facetious, and that's a bit unfair. There's nothing wrong with wanting to help the people of Africa address some of the challenges. But I think what came with that was much more of a sense of, you're poor, you're underdeveloped, and, you need us, you need our money, you need our aid. The evolution to the place where we see Africa as a continent that's rich not only in natural resources, which people have been coming in and taking those out since forever, right? Africa today still accounts for only about 3% of all global trade. So despite the fact that they have so much, they've got land, so they have agriculture, they've got, minerals and natural resources, they've got the critical strategic resources we need now, the cobalt that goes into batteries for our electric vehicles, coltan that goes into our cell phones and other products. And in all of the value chains, the Africans are usually at the very bottom of the value chain. They provide the things that are the cheapest, and then those get shipped out of the continent to other places, including to Asia, and then the value is added there. But I think, just to answer your question more directly, I think we're finally at a place where there are enough U.S. companies and others from around the world who are in Africa who realize that if you can invest in what Africa has to offer, if you don't see them as, sort of tragic, people who just need your help, but essentially they've got something to offer you, that you want to partner with them as equals, then I think that it creates the environment for a better partnership. And, we claim and all the time are looking at what the Chinese are doing there and what, the Russians are doing there. But, everybody in the world who wants to make money is in Africa. I mean, if you're a company now and you're trying to expand your business, you'd be crazy not to be looking at the continent of Africa as an incredible market. And so now you have lots of companies like that are members of CCA in many cases who are doing lots of business in Africa, in lots of countries across Africa. And of course, there's still some that have some challenges and some issues, some conflicts, but that's not the entire continent. And there are places where poor leadership and corruption are still issues. Nobody's going to lie about that, but that's not the entire continent. There are places where there are, diseases and poverty, but there's disease and poverty everywhere in the world. And so it's just a matter of, do you have the leadership and the resources to be able to address it? So I give the U.S. some credit. We're kind of slow. But I think we're finally, when we saw the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit that happened in December, I think there was a real recognition of the need to recalibrate that relationship, to treat Africans from the heads of state to everyone else with a certain amount of respect, and to recognize the kind of opportunities that Africa offers if you want to partner with them. And so now we've seen what the First Lady has gone, our Treasury Secretary Yellen has gone. I happen to know that there's another VVIP very soon that's going to be going. She'll be going to 3 countries in Africa very soon. I'm sure it's going to be announced in any day now. President Biden will be going to Africa. Our U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, she'll be going to Africa in August for the AGOA Forum that will be held there. And I think there are many others that are, many other high-level U.S. government officials that are on their way.
Great. So, as you said, the pattern is somewhat mixed in Africa, but we also know that some of the fastest growing countries in the world are in Africa. For the ones that are succeeding, what's the secret sauce? What do you see that's happening in these countries that are being successful in stimulating growth and opportunity?
So I think there are a couple of things, Dean. First of all, they are carving in many cases some paths of their own. If Africa had waited until they could have landline telephones, they'd still be waiting. There's a certain amount of leapfrogging that's happening. The digitalization of our economies, e-commerce and all of that. The first place I ever saw mobile banking, to be honest, was in Africa. And so I think use of technologies and innovation, that's part of the sauce that's making that possible. I have to go back to leadership. Leadership is very important. I think that those countries that have strong leaders and also a vision for what their country can be. And so I know there are a lot of issues with Paul Kagame. People will always talk about that, but I have to give him credit. Rwanda is so small, and Rwanda went through some horrific things, lost incredible numbers of people during the genocide that happened there. And yet today, Rwanda sees itself as the Singapore of Africa. It's small, it has a high level of internet connectivity, they're investing in their youth, they're doing manufacturing. I was surprised when they told us they wanted to be the hub of East Africa. I thought, how do you get to be the hub in a small, landlocked, mountainous country? They had no problems in positioning themselves that way. And so I think that comes from the leadership and the vision for the country. And whatever others may say about Kagame, there is zero tolerance for corruption there. And everybody knows it. I remember one of my first trips there, 15 years ago or more, and I saw people out early in the morning, like sweeping the streets. I was like, oh my gosh, they've got elderly people and young people sweeping the streets. Kigali, that's like one of the cleanest cities I've been to anywhere. And they told me those people volunteer to do that. They're not forced to do it. They're not paid money to do it. They just come out and everybody is like, we got to make sure that our streets are clean and that there's a way that we present, and everybody just gets involved and does it. So, you know, again, that's a sauce that's good, where your people feel like they have bought into the vision for the country, and that they're then your partners in advancing the country on every level. But I think those are key things.
That's great. So one of the things that's been talked about a lot as sort of a potential avenue for stimulating growth in Africa is greater cooperation and integration within Africa, both sub-regional and regional at the AU level. Talk to us a little bit about how much progress has been made, how important is this to the long-term success of Africa, and what still needs to be done?
So I tell people that the African Continental Free Trade Area is it's going to create the largest free trade market in the world. It'll have over 1 billion people, and it'll have over $3 trillion in combined GDP. It took a lot to be able to do that. It took many years. They had the sub-regional groups, whether it was, you know, the SADC region, the COMESA region, the ECOWAS region in West Africa. But pulling all of that together and then negotiating a free trade agreement that would cover the entire continent from north to south, east to west. And why would they do that? Because so many of the economies and countries of Africa are small countries, small markets. How do you incentivize investment into your country? You're competing against all the other tiny countries around you. And what this is doing now, and we're already starting to see it, is that those countries that are maybe some of the larger ones, say like Kenya, and so Kenya is the largest sub-Saharan African exporter of apparel to the US. I'll just use this as an example. So Tanzania produces a little bit of apparel, Uganda produces a little bit of apparel, but what you're seeing now is that countries around in a regional grouping can provide like the zippers, right? Or they can provide the buttons. So even though they're not the final place assembling the apparel, they're getting a piece of that market. And that's very important. And we see this in many sectors now. I visited a factory in Lesotho, which obviously is very small, completely surrounded by South Africa, right? It's an island nation within South Africa. And they were producing in that factory, there were about maybe 500 people or so in the factory. They were producing leather seats for cars in South Africa that then get shipped to the US under AGOA. So even though those car seats are not exported directly to the United States and don't count as AGOA trade for Lesotho, it actually is a part of that ecosystem. It's a part of the auto ecosystem. And that's what we want to see more happening in Africa. It's already starting. There's a zipper factory in Eswatini, which used to be Swaziland, that sends zippers to other countries in Africa, including Ethiopia and Kenya. And again, this is the way the world works now, right? Because someone told me, I don't know cars well, I don't know airplanes well, but they say if you open up any car, you'll find products in there from about a dozen different countries in one car. And so even though it'll say it's an American car or a Japanese car or a German car, in fact, there are lots of countries whose people have benefited that are in that car. And that's what we're seeing in Africa now, that there are inputs that are being made in African countries that are going into final products made in other parts of Africa and around the world. And that's what we want to see. And I would just, my thing that I'm always focused on is there was a report many years ago that talked about how if Africa, it had 2% of world trade at the time, if Africa could increase its share of world trade by just 1 percentage point to go from 2 to 3, that would be the equivalent of 3 times the amount of development assistance or aid that Africa was getting from everybody in the world. So the reason that trade and investment are so important is because that is the thing, that's the engine for economic growth for any country in the world, including the United States. And all we're saying is that this is a good time. I say this is Africa's time, but this is a good time to invest into Africa and its productive capacity, to help diversify what Africa ships to the rest of the world, to stop sending more than 70% of Africa's cashews go to Vietnam and India for processing. I mean, that's just like one example. And so they're capable of doing that. They're capable of making vaccines. They have people there who have the science, who have the acumen to do all sorts of things, but they need the investments, they need the partnerships. And that's where I think the U.S. is beginning to do a better job. I think our companies know. I think the government knows as well, but there's still a lot of focus on development assistance and still not quite as much a focus on the power of private sector-led growth. Though I do know for this trip coming up, this VVIP person, they were calling to say, okay, what can your members do in these areas? Can you connect us to them? Because we'd like to be able to announce during this trip what some U.S. companies are doing in climate change and women's economic empowerment in various areas, that digitalization. And so we were connecting them to different CCA members who operate in that area. But I do think the U.S. is shifting in terms of its the way that it engages with Africa. It is not looking at Africa as we simply want to be there to counter the Chinese. I think that's a really poor reason to be in Africa.
So let me ask one more, and then I'll turn to the audience. So if you have questions, get them ready. But there's been a lot of discussion about, a focus, as you say, on private sector-led growth, investment-led growth and stuff. There's also been a lot of concern about infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure to facilitate that. And it connects a little bit to the discussion about China because one of the arguments has been, as part of the Chinese efforts with Belt and Road and other things, that they're offering the infrastructure investments. How do you see the infrastructure needs of Africa now, and what are the opportunities or the avenues that can be met that gives an alternative to looking to China as the source of that investment?
No, and that's a great question. So I think, first of all, whenever we think about infrastructure, we should not just think about the hard infrastructure, the roads, the airports, et cetera. We should think about the soft infrastructure as well, the engineering that goes into it. We should think about financial services. We should think about all the services sectors. Telecom services, et cetera, because that's also a part of infrastructure. And so first thing is keep our idea about what infrastructure means broad. It can be health infrastructure and not just hospitals, right? But I think the other thing is that people don't always have all the right facts. So for example, one of the things that I know, because I've worked with the MCC, worked on the advisory council, we've put about $13 billion into infrastructure in Africa in the last 20 years. And it's in a range of countries that have had MCC compacts. Some have had 2 compacts, some are on their 3rd compact. But here's the thing that is like, sort of blows your mind. When Ghana was getting their first MCC compact, and it was a road, it was the George H.W. Bush Highway, excuse me, in Accra. And they put out the bids for the people who would build the road. No U.S. company bid on the road because we don't build roads generally. That's not what we do overseas. We're the engineering. We're in the piece of it that has to do with what are the right materials you use and so forth and so on. And the folks who don't pay attention to that, that's why those roads crack and sink and don't last, to be honest, right? So, not to throw the Chinese under the bus here, but I've been on enough roads and enough buildings in Africa to know that just because you got it for a good price doesn't mean it was a good deal. And so I got a call, frantic call from the ambassador of Ghana, who said, "Oh my gosh, Flory, you know, the president's getting ready to announce, and we hear that no American company has bid on the road. How can we have the George H.W. Bush Highway that's being paid for by the U.S.? I think it was a $250 million project. How can, how can we announce this and we don't have an American?" And the Chinese won that bid. Now, all that the people saw were the Chinese folks building that road. They brought in all their people and built that road. And on the side of the highway, there was a sign that showed that it said it was a MCC project, U.S. government, just on the side of the road. But the impression for many people was that it was a Chinese road. Same thing when I went to Cape Verde. We had an MCC project there at the port. The Portuguese won that bid, and so therefore everybody thought that the Portuguese had come in to make these incredible investments into that port. And I would just say all across Africa, there are examples of that. I'm not saying that other people aren't building things, but what I am saying is that the U.S. invests in infrastructure in Africa as well. We just don't get a whole lot of credit for it. We don't get the visibility. We are not good at blowing our own horn. The U.S. is we're terrible at it. And so, all the companies I know that are investing in various projects in Africa, from Google to Visa to, there's so many companies that are operating in Africa, investing in Africa, but still people say, where are the Americans? How come there are no Americans? And I'm going like, of course there are Americans in businesses in Africa. There's some that have been there 50, 60, 100 years. Caterpillar, Procter & Gamble, I could go on and on. But yet, the impression is that the U.S. is not there. So I would just say that we could do a lot more. We should do a lot more. I think this is a great time to invest in Africa, to diversify supply chains that were, really blocked during COVID. People should be trying to make sure there's some resilience in their supply chains. Why not invest in producing those things in Africa? We couldn't get semiconductors. Why don't we build, semiconductor plants in Africa? You couldn't get, batteries for electric vehicles. Why are we taking the cobalt out of DRC and shipping it to China to put into batteries there? Why doesn't Tesla invest in, or whoever, invest in electric vehicle batteries being produced in Africa? So that's what Africa needs. That's what Africa offers to the world today. And so, that's the thing that I think infrastructure is definitely needed. That your question was on infrastructure. There is investment into infrastructure that's happening in Africa, but it's at a deficit. It's just not nearly enough to supply what Africa needs in order. Power is another one. Right? Power is a big one, right? So I'll stop there.
Great. All right, terrific. So let me turn to the audience here. Questions for Ambassador Liz? Please, Josh.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Josh Harinza. I'm an employee here at SAIS. And I remember very vividly from the early 2000s, the struggle over AGOA. It was in Congress for a while, and there was a lot of argument back and forth. But it finally got passed. So I'm curious to hear from you, how much impact has it had up to this point?
So AGOA is something I've been very passionate about over the years. I'll say a couple things. One, I think when AGOA was passed in 2000, there was not really a full understanding that you couldn't just give them the opportunity to enter the market. That's what the O stands for in AGOA. That they also, and the access, right? But they also had to have the capacity to be able to ship products. And it took several years before, we were all standing there going, oh, the door is open wide. Where are the products? We don't see anything coming in. And it took us a while to figure out that we needed trade capacity building programs so that the Africans could actually produce the things that were good for the U.S. market or appropriate for the U.S. market in ways that were competitive. So that's the first thing. So capacity building support has gone into Africa. AID has done it. We have regional trade hubs. The other thing, though, that we hear is that very few countries in very few products have benefited from AGOA, that it's mostly oil. For Africa, that's the shape of, that's the way that they trade with much of the world. It's not surprising that oil and raw commodities constitutes a lot of what Africa sends to U.S. because it constitutes a lot of what it sends to China and everybody else, to be honest. But I think what is more important today, from where I sit, is debunking some of the stories. And I feel like I've been in probably more factories in Africa than like most people. And, you know, even when it's a small amount, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. One, I went in this factory in Swaziland, now Eswatini, and I knew of that factory because I was at a trade show in New York where they have all of the people who have different foods, and they come to New York and they all have their food items there. And this factory was producing jams and jellies from fruit, and they had one that was called peach ginger jelly. And when Trader Joe's came through to look at all the people, because it wasn't just Africans there, right? It was a, you know, a trade show with everybody there. What's that called? The New York Food Show or whatever it's called, but it happens every year, usually around July or August, at the Jacob Javits Center in New York. And the whole place is filled up with people who brought products. So that factory was there because USAID had prepared them for the trip, had made sure their labeling was proper. But that jelly was, I mean, that was the best, you know, peach, ginger, oh my gosh. And then I decided when I was taking a trip there, I would go and visit the factory. Well, the factory only had about maybe 80 women there. Most of them were people who had never had a formal job before. They had been street women. And then they could only produce one container a month. That was as much. And when they got another order to go beyond that, they were like, they put up their hands like, we can't handle anymore. This is as much. So now if you look at Swaziland's exports to the US, this would probably be so tiny that you might figure it doesn't matter much of anything, right? It's not going to be the big exports that maybe other countries in Africa are shipping, but it's enough that it has transformed the lives of those 80 or so women. It's had a knockoff effect for the other people who are benefiting, you know, the secondary benefits. And I can't tell you, and I'll stop there, I can't tell you how many women in small factories across Africa that I've talked to who told me, oh, you know, before I got this job, I couldn't pay the school fees for all my kids to go to school. But now I can pay for all my kids to go to school. Or one woman who told me that she had been able to put a new roof on her, you know, thatch roof on her home. And so I would say to Congress and anybody who says, well, you know, they're not really using it as much as they should, and utilization is low, and look at the numbers, they're so small. I don't know that there are going to be any countries, not just in Africa, but anywhere, who constitute huge portions of any value chain in the US, maybe other than China, right? Where even China might be, let's say, 35% of your imports of X, which is a lot, right? But our product mix is usually made up of, you know, hundreds of countries and thousands of companies from across the world. And it still benefits them whether they are 2% of that line item or 10% of the line item, or in the case of Africa, 0.1% of a line item. But my feeling very strongly is that Africa is benefiting from AGOA, and that you have to look beyond the big numbers, and you have to look across all the countries to be able to see what it's really doing for the people of Africa. And I can vouch for that because I've seen it.
Great. We have time for one more question. We have another question from the audience. Right there, please. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, ma'am. Thank you so much for coming to SAIS to speak with us today. My name is Veronica, and I am a second-year MA student studying development in Africa. I am also the daughter of a trader, so my mom used to go from Ghana to Togo to get cloth and bring them back to Ghana to sell. I'm curious to know, with the free trade area implementation, how should governments, African governments, ensure that women benefit from the implementation? Research shows that 70% of cross-border traders are women. And so how can African governments ensure that the benefits and the gains that come with the implementation of the agreement is attributed to women? Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and congratulations to you on being here, and congratulations to your mom who made it possible for you to be here. So the first thing I would say is that women have to be pulled into the formal sector more. It's very difficult, I think, for governments anywhere to really try to support the informal sector. I mean, it is informal. And, you know, just tracking them sometimes. Who are these people? You know, they don't have to be licensed a lot of times. Nobody knows who they are. There's been resistance among informal women. I've met them who didn't want to be a part of the formal because they would have to pay taxes. And they were like, I want to keep all my money, not realizing that by being a part of the formal economy, there were benefits that would come to them from that. But I hear them. It's like, okay, I make a little money. I'm not trying to give some of it back to the government. So people who are informal, pulling them into the formal economy is important. I think for the AFCFTA, there is, in fact, a protocol on women and youth. And I don't know if you know this, but all the key protocols have a champion that has been assigned at the head of state level for tracking and talking to people about what happens in that particular protocol. For the Women and Youth Protocol of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the only female head of state in Africa, who is the Tanzanian president, Her Excellency Samia Hassan, she is the champion, the AU-appointed champion for the Women and Youth Protocol of the agreement. And so part of what she's doing is everywhere she goes, she talks about the importance of pulling women and youth into African economies more generally, giving them the opportunities they deserve. Women, you know, even when they're small businesses, they can't get credit. You know, there's just access to credit. They need support in developing their business plans, all sorts of things. You know, male SMEs also need that, but women SMEs in Africa have, I think, more challenges than, you know, anybody. So it's, you know, how do you help women who are in the informal part of the economy, and there are many, you know, there's so many of them, millions. How do we do that? I don't think people have figured out quite yet how to do that. And then the last thing I'll share is I was talking to a woman the other day. She is a Ghanaian American, and she has a company called Shea Yeleen. And Rahama was telling me about how she works with all of these women who are in cooperatives in Ghana, and then they collect the shea nuts, and then they, you know, they've learned how to process at a fairly low level, and then it may come here to the U.S. and add other products into it. You know, lilac and lavender and this and that, right? So, but she was telling me that the women get paid in cash daily. So they come, they turn in their nuts, and they get paid in cash. And one of the things they're trying to do, they're trying to give these women phones where they have access to their own bank accounts, right? So what would happen is that instead of them having to come there and get cash, they would actually be able to access the money that's owed to them by using, a mobile phone. And the other piece of it is that if it goes into their own personal accounts, then the other thing that happens, and I hate to say this, is that you don't have the men who then basically, bless you, who then these women work hard. I don't know if you've ever seen how shea nuts are processed. It's backbreaking. And I've seen women with small babies on their backs doing it. It's a lot. And I was actually at a place in Nigeria where it was a shea processing project that USAID had. And the women were doing all this work. And those of us who were on this trip, we were all Americans, and we were all like, we wanted to give them some money, so some Naira. And so all of a sudden, as we were pulling out our money, these men showed up in front of our van. And so we were like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so all the women were just sort of standing back, and we were standing there like, wait a minute, we're not giving this money to these men. They had been sitting under trees, right, doing nothing. And so we decided this is literally, I was there, so I know. So we took our money and we put it in a bag, and we just said, oh, it's okay. So the men were telling us, you can give it to us. Literally, they had no shame. You can give us the money. We'll make sure they get it. So we said, no, thank you. And so basically, we drove off a ways, and then we were talking about what could we do. So essentially, we figured there was a woman, she was sort of the elder, and so what we do, we had one woman that went back and gave it to her. And so then we got, we waited at the van, and the woman from AID who had lived there the longest, she looked at us and she said, I hate to tell you this, but those guys already have that money. We haven't even gotten a mile down the road. Trust me, those guys have that money. So, I mean, there are a lot of things, that's, social thing. That was many years ago, maybe 8-10 years ago. There are things that have to happen in the countries themselves and in the culture itself that we can't control. That's a part of why I'm telling you this story, is that from the outside, you can try to say these are the things that we need to do to empower women and those traitor women like your mother. But on the other hand, if the culture doesn't change, then there's some things that you're probably not going to be able to get at.
Well, it's an especially appropriate. Exactly. On International Women's Day, it's an especially appropriate note to finish this on. Well, thank you so much. This is an extraordinary session, and really appreciate your taking the time to share it with us. So thank you very much.